Welcome to the very first balance patch in 2020 for Eternal. It's been a while since my last upload, but I wanted to do a video talking about the changes they've made to some cards in this particular patch, especially given that we got the patch notes early. That said, it'll be patch day by the time you see this video. It feels good to be uploading something again, but no more small talk. Let's hop right into the changes. First off, starting with the nerfs, and we're talking about Endra, champion of Shopka, which is the main nerf here. She has been changed from 2 costs needing double fire influence to play to 3 costs needing triple fire influence to play. So ding dong, the witch is dead, I guess. Endra was a solid unit in Expedition, but the real damage she was doing was in the Throne format. Haunted Highway basically resurfaced when this card was released in Promises by Firelight, and on top of that, it seemed like the player base was trying to find every possible way you could break Endra in the game. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the impact Endra had on Throne, since I myself haven't played the format since getting back into Eternal, but I've seen enough to know this was warping the format. Players did figure out some interesting ways to counter Endra, but to me it felt like you had to go to great lengths to do so. I was seeing cards like Unstable Form get played again in the little Throne gameplay I have seen lately. Not to mention a card like this can, and probably has, shut out entire archetypes completely, which is never a good thing if you want a healthy metagame. The second nerf we're going to be touching on is Haunting Scream, and this has changed from 2 costs needing 1 primal and 1 shadow influence, play a unit with cost 4 or less from your void, to now being a 3 cost spell needing a primal and shadow influence to play, and you play a unit with cost 5 or less from your void. A nerf to this card has been in the back of some players' minds for well over a year, to be honest, and I think those of us felt that if it was ever nerfed, it should only be a slight one, nothing major. A card like Haunting Scream is actually great for the game, as it promotes an entirely different strategy from the same old aggro, mid-range, and control wheel. I think Patrick Chapin put it best when talking about Haunted Highway early last year, and I quote, "Haunted Highway is a sophisticated strategy combining a variety of threats, interaction, and decision points, fueled by a somewhat exotic engine that gives it a different texture than other strategies. It capitalizes on a variety of synergies and has room for customization and adaptation, while also leaving a lot of room for opposing counterplay from well-prepared opponents. We generally believe there are more of these higher level strategies that the community hasn't found yet." So those were the words of Patrick Chapin, one of the designers for Eternal. So a card like Haunting Scream not only creates an entirely different but healthy strategy that opposing players need to think differently to prepare for, but it also offers a very complex strategy that demands the Scream player to think critically about every decision they make every single turn. Very few decks in this game do this, and I've always said that Scream decks were one of the hardest decks in the game to play, harder than most control decks, and I don't think that's a hot take. All that said though, this nerf I feel is within the realm of slight nerf that players were thinking. The only thing I'm afraid of now is what new strategies will pop up out of this for Throne, now that this thing can bring back 5 drops. A lot of players in the community have been trying to come up with new Scream targets, things like Jotun Feastcaller, and even Shogun of the Waste. But the one that I and others thought about was a little card called Umbran Reaper. There used to actually be a Scream deck that focused on reducing Umbran Reaper's cost to 4 so you could Scream it back, and the deck had a life gain sub-strategy to it. A few even tried to incorporate Life Force into the deck with stuff like Blood Call Invoker. So this change will be a big one to watch for in Throne. Moving on to the side buffs, and there are 2 of these. The first being Sand Spitter. This has been changed from a 4 power 5/2 needing 1-time influence to play to a 3 power 4/2 needing 2-time influence to play. This is a decent change, but I don't think it will be enough for Sandspitter to see serious play outside of maybe a few dinosaur decks, which this patch definitely showed some love to, by the way. Which is a shame, because I really like cards like Sandspitter. Being able to disrupt your opponent's hand while playing a threat at the same time gets me all kinds of excited. I'm the guy that's played cards like Slow and even Patience main deck after all. The biggest problem on Sandspitter remains its low health. The fact that it has no evasion adds to that problem. At least if it had flying, it would somewhat make up for the low 2 health. This needed either flying or at least double its health total to see any serious play, in my opinion, not a mere cost reduction. Especially given another change that we'll talk about much later on that still ends up giving this card too much competition. It's nice to be able to play this as a 3-drop now, but that 2 health number on a ground unit still means 2 drops and even a few 1 drops can trade into this guy. The second side buff is Predatory Carnosaur. This has been changed from a 7 power 7/7 needing triple time influence to play to a 6 power 5/6 needing triple time influence to play. This almost puts Predatory Carnosaur back to its original stats it had when the game first went into open beta, which is the same cost it'll have now, except it was a 6/6 back then. Direwolf did state they actually considered putting this back to a 6/6, but decided not to because they felt it would have too much impact against other mid-sized units. I can't help but think that Sandstorm Titan came to mind. Anyway, I don't think this will see much more play, except in dedicated dinosaur decks for those brewers out there, at least in Throne. As far as Expedition though, this might have a bit more potential, because a lot of the popular units played in Expedition are actually not that big. The biggest units that see play are some of the Pentawarp units like Tazbu and Siditi, but there are very few other units that see play that have those stat lines. Ela and Mizo in Elysian, Zolta Loyalists and Soulflame Rider in Argentport Paladins, and the 5-drop Sodi are the only ones I can really think of. Carnosaur will eat pretty much everything else and live to tell the tale, so this might be a consideration in time-based mid-range decks that want to curve up to 6. If someone can find one that isn't Elysian, that is. Maybe Praxis? Finally, moving on to the buffs from this patch. Most of these I'm not going to spend too much time on, since most of the buffs to these particular cards I don't think will change their usage much in Constructed, and this review isn't focused on Limited, where these may or may not see more usage due to these buffs. But there are a few I want to spend a little bit more time on. So let's start off with Charchain Flail. This has been changed from a 2-cost relic weapon needing 1 fire influence to play to a 1-cost relic weapon needing 1 fire influence to play. This is another change that almost puts Charchain Flail back to its original state, and there is still one more card to talk about that was given a similar buff. Charchain Flail used to have a keyword called Power Surge, where its strength stat was equal to how much power you paid for it, but you had to spend all remaining power you had left in order to play the card, no matter what. This actually meant you could play Charchain Flail for 0 power. A classic deck like Armory could do nasty things with Charchain Flail and Smuggler Stash back when Stash used to cost 5, because Flail keeps its original stats even in the Void, getting even stronger if you have any extra power left when played a second time. This almost brings it back to that level, but you need at least 1 power open to play it. While this is a welcome change, that still unfortunately makes Flail and Stash a turn 7 play for traditional Armory decks. I don't think this will ultimately change Flail's play rate much in either format, but I do think this should be a consideration in any deck running Fire. It's a lot more flexible now that the minimum cost is reduced to 1. Next up is Gilded Flames. This was changed from a 4-cost spell needing 1 fire influence to play to a 3 cost needing 1 fire influence to play. Not a huge buff as far as constructed usage goes. The cost for this would have needed to be cut in half, I feel like. And even then, it probably wouldn't be considered in most fire decks in Throne. Even if this was Expedition legal, I don't think fire decks in that format would consider it either. It's too expensive and too conditional, especially when compared to other options of the same cost or cheaper. Next is Phoenix Stone. This was changed from a 3 cost needing 1 fire influence to play to a 2 cost needing 1 fire influence to play. I personally like this change, but only because I have a soft spot for cards like Phoenix Stone. It reminds me of Flamestoker in a lot of ways, except it's much easier to blow out because answers to units are plenty in this game. And if the Phoenix token gets killed, you don't get the relic back. Unlike Flamestoker, which doesn't transform itself into a unit and just spits out an Infernus every turn for you instead. And because of that, this costing 2 doesn't change much, unfortunately. Next up is Arcanum Hourglass. This has been changed from a 3 one-time influence to a 2 cost one-time influence. Again, a welcome change, but nothing groundbreaking. It just makes one of the slower engines in the game a bit faster. That being this card and Torgal's Trading Post. But, I mean, hey, the engine gives you guaranteed power, so you can play Hearthstone, while your opponent plays Eternal, except you don't have a mana cap either. Next is Bisma Revered Elder. This has had its cost reduced from 4 to 3, with the same Justice Influence requirements. This costing 3 does feel a lot better now. Bisma still sucks though, don't get me wrong. But I always felt that 4 power was way too much for this guy. That said, Bisma got moved from a 4 cost slot with competition that was way better than him to a 3 cost slot with competition that's still likely better than him. Curving Bisma into Shelterwing Rider and Throne could be cute though. Up next is Embargo Officer. This has had its shift cost change from 2 to 1. This is another great change. Officer was one of those cards I'd consider in Justice aggro decks, but having to wait until turn 2 or later to shift it always felt awkward when I briefly tried it. Now, this is a true 1-drop, which is a welcome addition in a faction that doesn't have many good 1-drops. Next, we have Tax Collector. This has had its ultimate cost change from 7 to 5. I doubt this increases Tax Collector's play rate in either format, though if it had any chance of seeing play, it would happen in Expedition before Throne, barring a new set or any change in the Throne meta. That said, this is great overall because 7 power was always way too much for this ultimate. Next, we have Treasury Gate. This has had its cost change from 4 and a single Justice to 3 and a single Justice. I doubt this increases the play rate of Treasury Gate either, but it's a fine change. 4 cost did feel a bit high for this card. The main issue that keeps Gate from being an attractive card that Armory decks would consider still remains though. Making tokens with your relic weapons is nice, but most relic weapons in this game don't have battle skills. And the few that do are pretty bad for the most part. The best one was Sword of Icaria, and that has fallen off massively ever since the early days of set 1. In order for this to see more play, we need to see powerful relic weapons with attractive battle skills that would see play in constructed formats. Next up, we have Eye of Winter. This has had its cost change from 3 and a primal to 2 with needing a primal to play. So we need to make a pit stop here and really talk about this one. This change is pretty scary. Even though it's never had a huge impact in any metagame, with its best days being during closed beta, Eye of Winter has always been this boogeyman card for me, and I'm sure a few other players too, waiting to just lock down your board until you concede out of frustration. In general, it can have a really powerful effect in control decks that play wrath effects like Harsh Rule or End of the Story. There is Shenra Speaks as well, but Ive Winter isn't legal in Expedition, and I'm going to argue that's probably a good thing. There is another deck where I could be powerful though, and will potentially have more impact than in your generic control deck, and that's any deck running Elvish Swindler. With this now costing 2, Swindler can fetch this out of your deck and play it for free. And with Swindler getting buffed fairly recently, this could be the beginning of something in the Throne meta. Even if it doesn't, I think control players running Primal should be considering this card for their markets if nowhere else. Being able to play this and activate it as early as turn 4 is much better than the previous turn 5 play. Next we have Regression. This has had its cost reduced from 4 power to 2 power. This is still going to be a bit too slow for any generic deck to run this card, but now there's only one reason why instead of 2. The effect is just too slow. But at least now it's not a card that's too expensive to cast and has an effect that's too slow. So a card like Regression will only see the light of day in a dedicated Mind Link deck, which was running some copies of this card anyway. That deck is the biggest winner of this change. Sadly, this still isn't good enough to even be considered for a market slot in more standard decks. Up next we have Fearbinder, who has had its ability cost change from 4 power to 2 power. Again, this is another change that won't be making waves at the higher levels of rank play, but like Regression, there is one deck that is a big winner, and that's the dedicated Fearbinder decks that generate tokens to sacrifice. I've only personally experienced playing Xenon variants a few times, but I'm sure there are other variants out there. It's still a great change because paying 4 was way too much, considering you also needed to sacrifice 2 units. That's a lot, even if you play cheap units that do synergize with this card. Up next we have Hideout Pistol, which will now give Voidbound to units it kills. This card was already a staple in Gunslinger decks, and now it gets even better. It won't affect any other deck, but Gunslingers definitely got stronger with this one in Throne. Now we need to see if it'll be enough to bring them back into the Throne meta. Next we have Vile Collaborator. This has had its stats increase from a 2-2 to a 2-3. So this is a nice little bump for this card. 2-2 was just too small for this 3-drop because if you're going to play a unit with an Anthem type effect, it needs to have high health. And 2 health is just way too small, even if you don't plan to block with this guy. That said, 3 health is still fairly small for a 3-drop. And Dragon decks have better things to play for 3 power, like Kozin. Next, we have Knucklebones. This has had its cost reduced from 7 power to 6 power, with the influence requirements remaining the same. Make no mistake, this card still isn't good. But does it really matter? Does it really matter? Now you can have loads of fun 1 turn earlier. This is still best in dedicated control decks. And even there, you could be playing a better card than Knucklebones. But again, does it really matter? Next, we have Avasaur Patriarch. This has had its cost change from 4 cost, double time, double primal, to 3 cost, double time, and single primal. So this is probably tied with Carnosaur for the biggest change for dinosaur decks. There have been a lot of different dinosaur brews built by a lot of players, but the best dinosaur decks have always played Avasaur Patriarch. Sadly, this is also the dino responsible for giving Sandspitter so much competition, and it just won't leave Sandspitter alone in peace, since Patriarch has decided it also needs to be a 3-drop now. Dinosaurs have always had a ramp strategy attached to it, with access to other cards like Sauropod Wrangler and Avarax Familiar, and this change just makes them faster now. Probably still not good enough to see serious play in Throne, but the buff to one of the deck's core pieces is very much appreciated. And finally, we have Withering Witch. This has had its stats change from a 1/1 to a 1/4. So this is the last change, which isn't a change, but a nearly complete reversal to what the card used to be. So this is a similar story to Charchain Flail and Predatory Carnosaur. Withering Witch used to be a 1/4 once upon a time. However, the effect it has now is different from what it used to do. The way the text on this card used to work in game is that you could use this to instantly kill damaged units. Withering Witch saw a lot of play in early Felon control decks because of this. So you'd play something like Lightning Storm on turn 7 first, and then drop this down and instantly wipe the board. Direwolf has since changed the way this effect works without actually changing the wording on the card though. Now it will always bring units to 1 HP regardless. So you have to play your Lightning Storm after playing Withering Witch. Which, being a 1/1 at the time of that change, meant you ended up killing your own Witch. So because of that, it stopped seeing play. Now, Witch probably still won't see much, if any, additional play though with this change. Granted, just dropping this on turn 5 was still decent, so I'm hoping between that and Withering Witch being a 1/4 again, that players will at least consider this in their decks running Primal and Shadow. It's still very splashable, but we'll see. Throne has changed so much since this card was in the meta, so it's unlikely. That's all I've got for you guys today. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. If there's anything you think will change that I didn't discuss, feel free to share it in the comments below. I've got some other videos in the works, so if you don't want to miss those, make sure to subscribe to the channel. For those not in the know, I've also recently come back from a streaming hiatus too, and I've been streaming Eternal on Twitch again for the past few weeks. So feel free to follow me on Twitch if you want to catch me live streaming the game. Link is in the video description below. But thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.